Hey everyone, my name is Wade Prue. I'm the QA manager here at Kula Partners. I just want to take a few minutes to talk about a new utility we've been using around the shop past couple of months called Sentry and how it can let us use log and environmental data a lot more effectively. So nearly everything that we do in all the environments that we use day to day is logged. Browsing to a page, generating an error, it's going to generate a linked log entry. So every one of our environments, be it the local environments we run for doing day-to-day development, our dev and staging environments, or live environments, they all generate logs. What kind of differentiates them a little bit as far as how those logs are generated is where they generate to and kind of the files that they generate to. So on a production host, for instance, that's going to have its own set of error and access logs, whereas on our development hosts anyways, we're going to have one shared log for multiple hosts, and that will all become relevant in just a moment here. So say that I've got a new issue that I'm trying to debug based on a new change set. If there's nothing really relevant or helpful on the front end, the logs actually pose a really good place to start looking around. But it can be difficult to browse around for the reason I mentioned before, that the logs are broken up over different environments. And then given the log size and their layout, they can be really tedious to navigate. So like I mentioned, the logs themselves can be kind of tedious. You can see the screenshot here of just a generic WordPress log. There's a lot going on here, but there's a lot of really good information in it. So back to the example of having a new issue to debug. Let's say that I know how to reproduce the issue well enough, and I have access to the log itself. So what I'd want to do is set up what's called a grep and tail on the log. So tailing a log, if you have access to the log, what you can do is set up what's called a tail command, and it's going to follow the contents of the log as they actively update. So if a new log line gets added, it gets printed back on your screen, whereas a grep command is going to filter the contents being printed back to you. So again, with the example I mentioned before, if I had a new error for a given site, I'd probably want to set up a grep for that site and maybe what I thought was in the error while I'm tailing the log. So it's a little tedious just where there's so many steps involved and you have to have a lot of pre-existing information. So let's say that you can actually find the error. How do you know if someone had dealt with it before? How do you know if the log line's perhaps unrelated? How do you know when that event started happening? Like, again, looking at the example here, it's a little bit of a wall of text. But there is a lot of really good information here. If you look at the example, we get all sorts of information about where errors are taking place, where the user was browsing to when they saw that error, the time and date codes being printed back, the WordPress version information. There's a lot of really good stuff in here. The problem is it's just very poorly organized. So on the face of it, the use of the logs is highly reactive. Why would you bother digging around in here unless you knew exactly what you're looking for? And that's where Sentry comes in. So in short, Sentry is a data aggregation tool. It presents a single unified web front end reading diagnostic data from multiple locations. So it doesn't actually read the logs itself, but it actually works as kind of a hook on a given application to take data that would otherwise go to the log, and then it pulls it into one common source. So it will take all of this log or log type data, index it, cleans up the formatting, and then it catalogs all of the meta associated with it. So all the data that we saw on the previous slide, like the date codes, the timestamps, the version information, that all becomes meta that's associated with a given event. And while all this sounds really boring on the face of it, it totally changes how we can use this type of data. So I just want to give a quick demo of Sentry and how it behaves. So pulled up here is the Sentry Frontend it's actually a plugin site that we use internally at Kula Partners. So what we see here is basically the same data that we would see represented in the text log that we saw in the previous slide, except all of this is indexed based on exceptions or warnings or given log events, and then they're all categorized together and grouped by event. So as you see here, we get the type of exception or warning or what have you printed down the left. when it last took place, printed just below that, along with a timestamp. And then off on the right-hand side, we have some further information about those events as well. We get event occurrences in the graph, how many times the event's taken place, and then the users that event has taken place against as well. And then we can do a bunch more information with this too. Sorry, a bunch more things with this too, rather. If we open up the sliders on the right-hand side, we can do all sorts of filtering against this without ever having to get into command line utility or grepping or filtering through logs at all. So let's say, for instance, that we want to filter by OS. All of this information would normally be printed back on the log side, but it'd be really, really difficult to filter by. So what we can do here is basically just pick the filter, and this is just going to filter this down to events that came from a given OS. So where this becomes useful is if we know that there's an issue in the field that's happening for a given OS, we can just filter for it here. Going a step further, if we want to get into environment specifics, where we know a lot of environments share common logging destinations, we can actually filter out by environment here. This site's not the greatest example where we've only got one development site that's being used for this case, but if we look at other client sites, it's going to be broken out into production, staging, local, and development, all displaying their log entries in one common location, and it makes it much, much easier to filter through that log data. Drilling into the events themselves, we'll just pick an event off the top here. We get even more information about it. So like I was saying before, in the instance of trying to pick through logs and getting a lot of repeating events, what we can do here is see all the events grouped together into one single log event. So this would represent the most recent event, or most recent instance of this log entry presented here, whereas we can actually page back through all the other log events that are grouped as this event. And then we get all that other meta that I was talking about printed back in a much more usable interface. We get browser, the environment, languages, and a bunch of other helpful meta. A WordPress version, which would be a really helpful one around the shop as well. Jumping further down, you can get into kind of the meat of things where the problem actually came up on the code side. So from a debugging standpoint, it becomes very, very helpful there as well. And just jumping back to the site for a moment as well, we can do a few more interesting things here. We can do all sorts of sortation types against it, sorting by frequency or priority. Furthermore, we can actually set this up so it will actually print the events back live. So whereas before, if I wanted to get the log contents for a given error or event, I would have to tail the log. I can just let this run and then have those events pop up without any interaction from me at all, without any filtering from me at all. With all that said, I'm just going to get back to the presentation here. So where can we use this utility? Just because we can use it doesn't mean that we necessarily want to. I think there's a lot of choice that we have to make around where we implement this. A client that comes to Kula Partners with a site that has been broadly developed by another agency or by themselves internally would be a very, very different use case than us building a site fresh. Whereas if we built a site fresh out of the box, we'd be aiming to launch it with basically perfectly clean event logs. It's going to make parsing through those a lot easier in the future. Whereas if we have a client that we're bringing aboard, we don't necessarily know what the development practices were outside of our shop. So it would be much more looking at what had changed or what new events are bubbling up inside of Sentry itself. So again, ideally, it's not something we want to use everywhere. The approaches are going to differ greatly from site to site. So there's thought that has to be put into it before we implement it. So I wanted to just jump through some use cases. Like I touched on at the beginning of the presentation, on the face of it, logs are really boring, but I think there's a lot of really interesting use cases for a few different role types around the shop. And I just wanted to page through those kind of quick. So for my day-to-day as a quality assurance guy, Sentry's just been nothing but a blessing. Like I was touching on earlier in the example in my the opening of my presentation, there's no need to tail a log and then leave that tail running while I'm testing. You basically get to set up Sentry and then walk away, go do your testing, and come back. Because you can time box the events that are being printed back in Sentry. If I know when I'd started testing, or if I know a build that I'd started testing against, I can just filter based on that and just see if there's any new events being reported that I should be aware of that would coincide with the testing that I was doing. And you can actually approach Sentry as more of a cleanup task rather than having to actively manage or pay attention to those log events as a result. Where we're pulling all of the production and staging and development logs into one common source, we're actually able to learn a whole lot about the production events too. So from a testing perspective, it's obviously difficult to catch every single little issue with a site before it goes out the door. That said, what we can do is learn from the user behavior, because we get the production logs printed back in such a way where we can filter by production and we can see which pages clients were browsing to when they saw given events. What we can actually do is learn more about how we should be testing things and how we can improve our test plans for a given site or for a given type of site going forward, just based on where we see errors coming about in user activity in production. And it's also a great tool to test or to support testing of really boring tasks. Obviously, not everything that's developed is the most exciting thing in the world. For instance, trying to test things like WordPress updates can be a very tedious task. It's not always evident on the face of it when things break or when we're getting things like deprecation warnings bubbling up in the logs. So, like I was touching on before with the time boxing, what you could do in this instance, if you have a given site that we know works a certain way and we know what errors are expected or warnings are expected, and we go do a WordPress update and go do our testing, our regression testing around that update, what we can do is then go back into Sentry once we finish that testing, set the WordPress version filtering to the version we just updated to, and see if there's any new events that are popping up since we've done that testing. And it makes it much easier to go back through and then basically deploy confidently. Whereas if we didn't necessarily have that, it's a very easy type of testing to kind of fall into a haze on. It's very easy to miss things. So from a testing perspective, provides a lot more confidence in what I'm doing when the test tasks become a little tedious. From a development or a designer perspective, I think it lends a lot of benefits there too. So to a degree, it can help with code quality because it's not just errors that are bubbling up on the Sentry side, it's warnings and informational messages. You can see a lot of things like bad variables being passed, for instance, that would otherwise go unnoticed. So if you have a given chunk of code that's set up to work and accept a variable that might not necessarily be in the syntax that it should be, it's going to work just fine on the front end. However, you might be able to improve your code quality overall, knowing that warning is bubbling up. It would definitely pop up in the logs, but if you didn't know to go look in the logs because the front-end behavior was unchanged, then you wouldn't necessarily know to go back and clean that up. So this presents a really interesting use case for developers in particular. Like I was touching on earlier in the presentation as well, because we can run this on our local environments, it's a lot easier to see in one common location if you're the only one having an issue. So say you've got a given branch pulled down in your local environment, you're trying to test something. It's not necessarily a matter of kind of taking a poll around the shop as to, hey, is this breaking for you? It's breaking for me. You can go in and then look at those event groupings I was demonstrating earlier, page back through them, and then see which other local environments are having issues. and then be able to follow up on it from there and be able to gather information. It's much more of a passive process for everyone to rally around a given defect and fix it than it is kind of actively going out and getting the temperature in the room. Going back to deploying and testing with confidence, when we go to do things like massive upgrades inside of an environment, so doing some kind of e-com upgrade on a platform. So WooCommerce, for instance, recently did an upgrade where myself and a few of the developers around the shop had to go back and do some discovery around, well, what does this break from the previous version of WooCommerce? And on the face of it, it didn't seem to break a whole lot. Everything worked just fine on the front end. But if all we were doing was taking the front end into account, there was a lot on the back end we would have missed. In this particular example, there were a lot of deprecation warnings coming up on the logs and in Sentry as far as the functions that we were calling in the older version of WooCommerce that were going to be deprecated in a later version. So it wasn't necessarily that it was going to break right away, but it gave us early warning as to things that would break unless we addressed them currently. And then not only did it give us early warning, it made it much easier to go back and retest those things. So again, working with the developers that I was working with on this, we could quickly index all of those issues, fix them, and then go back through to retest them and then see if those issues would bubble back up again in Sentry without having to go back through and tail the logs and watch for the issues bubbling up in the logs like we normally would have had to. It made the whole process a lot more seamless. There was just a lot less back and forth and a lot less guesswork involved. So again, with regards to confidence, it allows everyone in the shop to do deploys with a lot more confidence. Not just deploys of small fixes, but even doing larger site deploys, because we can do things like actively watch customer behavior and see what bubbles up on the production side of things without them having to report it. It really changes how we do those deploys and the confidence with which we do them. And to that point, the tool itself has a lot of implications for doing sprint and client management too. So it removes the reliance on a client reporting an issue. Just because a client runs into an issue on the front end doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to sit down and then open a support ticket for that particular issue. Going a step further in the sprint manager or client management role, you can do things like set up team members to be notified when events of a particular type bubble up inside a Sentry. So say, for instance, that we have a interest in being notified amongst the team when a error of a particular significance pops up in Sentry. You can just basically set up a filter in Sentry that will send an email to those team members and then get them back on the case and fixing that up and looking into it. Without you having to, like I touched on, rely on the customer or wait for them to go, or sorry, wait for your team rather, to go look over the events in Sentry. So with doing that production level debugging, it does change things there too. So for instance, if we had a client who said, I have an issue, it happens intermittently, maybe with some browsers. If we knew something about that client as far as IP address, or if we knew that they were logged into the site as a given WordPress user when that event took place, all it would take for us is to go into Sentry, set a filter based on the information that we do know about them, and then we can quickly learn a lot more without having to get into a long, protracted back and forth about what kind of browser they were using, what page they were hitting, and exactly what they were doing. It puts the power back in our hands, and it really takes some of the frustration out of the client side of it as well, where they just want the issue fixed. They don't want to fill out a support ticket. They don't want to provide an endless page of information. They just want it fixed, and it really cleans up a lot of that interaction and makes things easier for everyone. And then the last thing too, on the sprint and client management side of things too, is it's great for doing triage. Inside of Sentry, you can actually see who's looked at a given issue, and you can actually mark them resolved as well. So it's taking a lot of the guesswork out of who's seen what. and just presenting that all in just one clean interface. Commenting as well is a component of this. So if we have a particular issue that there's a back and forth on amongst the dev team, we can comment on that issue inside of Sentry and archive it inside of Sentry so it doesn't bubble up anymore and cause any more concern. So I think a lot of what I've touched on with Sentry is kind of the tip of the iceberg. I think there's a lot more we could be doing with it that we're not presently doing, and I just want to touch on some of that stuff as well. So release tracking, I think, is the biggest thing. What we can be doing is tagging each of the releases we have going out into production with a given release number that Sentry recognizes, and then it adds another level of filtering and kind of segmentation to the meta that's presented there. So for instance, if we have a build of a site v1 and we have a massive change set that we tag with v2, we can see represented inside of Sentry that clean break between the two and see which errors only existed in v1 as compared with errors that existed in v2, and it makes parsing through that even easier. Jira integration is another really good example of a step we can take this in. Like I was touching on, with the ability to comment on issues in comment on events in Sentry or archive them. We can also do direct Jira integration. So if an event of particular significance, say like an error level event rather than a warning and informational event comes up, we can have it just go ahead and create a Jira ticket directly. So rather than having to rely on the notifications that I touched on or rely on someone going in and checking on it, it will just create that ticket right away and then have it dumped into a queue. Like I was touching on as well, with the ability to look at some of the user information. So for instance, if the user's logged into WordPress, it gives us the ability to actively reach out to clients when we see issues. So for instance, if we know that there's a major issue that we need to address, but we don't know who's encountering it, what we can do is go filter by drill down to the event rather, and then look at the list of users who are associated with that event, and we get a pretty good feel for who's experiencing that. So as far as assessing impact, or like I said, directly reaching out to people, it gives us another way of really actioning that and getting out ahead of issues before they're reported to us. And then recently added as well is the ability to have deploy emails. So something I've noticed around the shop is that it doesn't always get around when we do a deploy of a new release or a change to a client's website. It's a little more word of mouth, it seems. But what we can do is actually set up a hook inside of Sentry so that when it recognizes that a new version of a site has gone out, it will actually send out an email to people that we have configured inside of Sentry to notify them, which I suppose is kind of awesome from a camaraderie standpoint if it's a big new site launch, and from a support standpoint if someone doesn't necessarily know that a new update went out on a given site, but they see support tickets coming in the next morning, they might not draw the connection right away. However, this really kind of shores up both sides of that. Anyways, I hope that was a good quick little primer on the value of Sentry. There's a lot of stuff about it that I didn't cover, but I highly encourage you to take a moment and drill down into the documentation on their site. There's a lot of really good information on there. Conversely, if you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out to us, and we'll do our best to help. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.